Hello, and welcome back to the Just Follow Joy podcast. My name is Ariana Joy. I'm your host, and I'm a human design reader and teacher. And today we are talking to my good friend and our resident astrologer, Caitlin Goehring, all about Saturn and Saturn returns, both from an astro and a human design perspective, because they are a little bit different because they're just different systems. And even Saturn means slightly different things in these two systems, which is really cool. So we talk about that, and then we give you bits and pieces of our charts and interpret those for each other too, which is fun. And I tell you that because I know sometimes when people are watching this kind of thing, they're like, this doesn't apply to me. This is so specific to you. But we talk a lot about Saturn returns in general. So you're going to learn about what that means. And that's a good chunk of the first part of the episode. And then later on, we talk a little bit more about our charts. Again, just to give you examples of how this can play out. And because we're just so cool, don't you want to know more about us? And remember, if you like the show, if you could like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or do whatever you can to leave positive feedback on whatever platform you're listening on, that would be so helpful and so awesome, and I appreciate it. With that said, let's dive in and hear from Caitlin. Actually, there's one more thing I forgot to say, so I had to go back and record this. Don't forget that both Caitlin and I give personal one-on-one readings. So Caitlin gives incredible astrology readings. I would know, I've gotten them from her before. And I give human design readings. And if you want to get a combo astro and human design reading, you can do that with us as well. These are really fun. They're one of our favorite things to do. And they're not going to be a full reading on either side. They're definitely not going to be a comprehensive reading of astrology and human design together either, but they can really give you this beautiful, well-rounded understanding of your cosmic blueprint and what you're here for and how you're here to do it. If you want to come in with a specific question, you can do that. Or if you just want a general reading, we can do that too. And we'll pick out important, helpful, and really fun things to tell you about. Okay, now let's go talk to Caitlin. All right, we have a lot to talk about today, so let's dive in. Let's talk about Saturn in astrology and what it means versus Saturn in human design, because y'all might not know, we use a lot of the same planetary placements that you would in astrology, but they do not mean exactly the same thing. They are often quite similar, but not exactly the same. So what does Saturn represent in astrology?
Saturn represents a lot of different things within astrology, but it's really connected to discipline, limitation, and ultimately like boundaries. So Saturn is the last of the outer planets within traditional astrology, but it's the last visible planet. And meaning all of the planets beyond that, you have to have like a telescope or some kind of visual aid to be able to see. And so Saturn really is representative of this sense of like boundary, like it's the furthest extending point. And so it teaches us about how we engage with boundaries, the things that create limitation and boundary within our lives, as well as like how it is that that actually shows up for us on a day-to-day basis. So sometimes when we're experiencing Saturn transits, it can feel like we're experiencing some kind of like external limitation, or where what it is that we're wanting to do or trying to put into place is kind of like not able to take root as seamlessly as we might want, where we're coming up against different like barriers and things like that. Saturn is also connected to authority and how it is that we connect to systems of authority. It's connected to hierarchy. Saturn is really all about structures. So being able to take that and apply that in a lot of these different spaces, again, it's that connection to like, what's our relationship like to people that we perceive having more power than us? What's our relationship like to spaces that have some kind of structured hierarchy? Things like the government is attributed and connected to Saturn because it's like this governing body that's creating structure and also creating some kind of like hierarchy amongst the community. So there's a lot of different ways that Saturn like applies, but those are just the really general themes within Saturn. And then of course there's so much nuance as far as like what placement Saturn is within your own chart. So that'll be based off of like the sign and the house. That'll teach you about the ways that you're naturally engaging with these like Saturnian things, as well as like where in your life you're experiencing that.
Beautifully put. Also, Caitlin and I have Saturn in Pisces because it's a kind of generational thing, right?
It takes about 2.5 to 3 years to move through each sign. So it's not fully generational, but it kind of is. And it's a way a lot of astrologers use to break down the outer planets, which are considered more generational. So, like, for example, we're both Pluto and Scorpio generation as well. Most millennials are Pluto and Scorpio. And then from there, there's like subsets within that where we're both in the Saturn and Pisces. subsect of the Pluto and Scorpio generation, whereas there's like the Pluto, or I'm sorry, the Saturn and Sag, Saturn and Aquarius, Saturn and Capricorn, and they're all different like flavors of how that's coming through.
Yeah, and then within that too, which we'll dive into, in human design, the astrological signs are basically chopped up into the gates. And so Caitlin and I both have Saturn in Pisces, but we don't have it in the same gate, which is really interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. But then also the house affects it too. So my Saturn is in the third house, which has to do with communication, really close relationships like siblings, childhood, not necessarily technology, but like writing and communication, because it's ruled by Gemini, which is related to Mercury. And then which house is your Saturn in?
My Saturn's in the 11th house. So those are themes around like the group, communities, societies that you're involved within. It's also like aspirations, ideals, goals that you have. So it's interesting about both of our Saturn placements is they're both the houses that are connected to community. The third house is like immediate community. So it is like you said, like those close relationships, like your siblings, but it's also your neighborhood and your neighbors. So like, I don't know, if you go walk to a coffee shop, the people that you're around, that's your third house. But like your 11th house are groups that you're a part of. So, more like, I don't know, I've like been involved at this yoga studio for like 6 years. That's like my 11th house. That's not my third house because it's not like in my immediate surroundings. Instead, it's this
Mm.
group that I'm a part of. So it's interesting because there's clearly a lot of different like flavor to both of those houses. But for both of us, we're both experiencing that Saturn um, pressure, sense of limits, sense of restriction in some ways around community that we're involved in.
Okay, so that's Saturn in astrology. Buckle up, because we're talking about Saturn in human design now.
I can't wait to learn about this.
All right, it's not like super different. There are just a few differences because human design is a system that also employs strategy and authority, the function of our specific aura shapes and types. So using that in life and then how that is going to affect how Saturn plays out. So actually in human design, we need to start with Jupiter. So in human design, Jupiter is similar to astrology, where it represents expansion and in a way luck too. In human design, though, it really represents this inner law that it's a big part of how you live. So it's really a big part of how you live out your design. It's kind of like your inner personal philosophy that you can't change, that is very inherent to you, that feels really right to you. And your conscious Jupiter, so the Jupiter that's on the right side of your chart in black, that is actually going to be the most impactful planet on your chart outside of the conscious sun gate. So because Jupiter is a really large planet, and the idea is that it creates a lot of neutrinos, basically like our human design chart shows us like where we're impacted by the neutrinos of different objects, and the celestial objects are really big and really powerful and create a lot of that energy. And so we are impacted by, the energy from those planets. In Jupiter is a really big planet. So outside of the sun, it's going to be really influential. And wherever Jupiter is placed, like whichever gate, it's something that you really need to stick to and honor and follow, because when you do that, that's how Jupiter can help you attract more opportunities. So that's kind of where I was saying it relates to luck like it does in astrology. And this is especially in the material world too. It's basically like the essence of following your design. It's a really big part of it, because Jupiter basically says like, when you honor yourself, I honor you. And more than that, life honors you. So that's where
Mm,
we start with this. And the reason why this is so important to know, and I'm going to bring this in when I talk about Caitlin and my charts, is because when we don't follow that inner law that Jupiter has established for us, like when we follow it, there's expansion, there's growth, things just feel right, things fall into place for us. When we don't do that, that is when Big Daddy Saturn comes in and he's like, all right, that teacher that you had in like elementary school, middle, maybe even high school, who was like, come on, guys, like, do what you know is right, and I believe in you, and really rewarded you when you did what was right. And I guess you followed the rules, right? But like when you were being the person that your teacher knew you could be, they're like, good job, you get an A. And then Saturn is like the principal who walks into the room and is just like, when you're not listening to this teacher, I come in and you sit your ass down and you start learning. Like that's what happens. So honestly,
mm,
the idea is outside of your Saturn return, Saturn is like pretty much going to leave you alone unless you start like really messing up. And that's when it comes in. So like that Saturn is praising you when it leaves you alone. My friend's boyfriend is a surf instructor, and he's like always like if you get a lesson with him, he's like always criticizing you. And he told me once, he was like, yeah, I am really really stingy with the praise that I give out, right? So like if I'm just not criticizing you, then you know that you're doing well. And that's kind of how
Mm.
Saturn is.
Yeah, that is so Saturnian. I see that
Yeah.
so much in like Capricorn and Aquarius placements too, both of the signs that Saturn rules. It's like it's so real. And it's so interesting to hear the connection of Jupiter and how inherently connected it is with Saturn within the human design chart. All of that totally makes sense to me and fits from an astrological perspective, but I wouldn't have personalized Jupiter so much with it, but that's totally what it is. And I mean, ultimately, Saturn is the same on both ends at the end of the day, which, in the sense of like, Saturn just wants you to be at your very best and to be doing your best, and is going to like let you fucking know when you're not there.
Hmm.
And even if that is in a way that feels like it's like knocking your face into the pavement, it's like, wake up, like, we know you can do better. But ultimately, it's this very like it's a very caring, tough love. Like it's really just about building you up and connecting you to what it is that your potential holds and who you really can be and who you're here to be. And being really clear with you when you're not that way versus like that Jupiterian teacher that's like praising you and so supportive and so lovely is probably just going to kind of like not engage so much when you're like not living into the quote unquote like right or best way, which is also fine. Like they're just different styles of learning. But yeah, that's really cool to hear. So I'm sorry, I think that I cut you off, but I'm curious about the difference between like the conscious and the unconscious Saturn.
Yeah. With the conscious Saturn, so you're going to be more aware of your stumbling blocks. And also, when I'm going to be talking about the Saturn return in human design, we're really only going to take into account the conscious Saturn because that's what your Saturn return is
Mm,
referencing. It's not talking
yeah.
about your design Saturn. So you're going to be more aware of these stumbling blocks coming up when you're not living in alignment with your design. And we'll talk about that with my chart and then with Caitlin's chart. You are going to be the only person who can tell me how this applies to your life, but I can tell you how definitely I see my conscious Saturn show up for me. And then your unconscious Saturn is really mostly the stumbling blocks other people are going to be seeing you go through, or it's like what your
Mm,
body will be drawing you into, and you'll be asking yourself, why do I feel so stuck? I don't understand, because it's unconscious. You're not as aware that this is where you start getting into those limiting patterns of Saturn, or the restriction or the struggle or the challenges. You'll be like, something is wrong, but what's wrong? Well, it could be that it's because you're showing up in your unconscious Saturn because you're not following your unconscious Jupiter, you know? I would say the conscious Jupiter
mm.
really plays the biggest role here. But yeah, so that's good to know too. And then I wanted to say one thing about Saturn returns. So first, Caitlin, why don't you talk about how long they last in astrology and kind of like what that experience is like?
Absolutely. So the Saturn return is what happens or what you experience when Saturn comes back to the place that it was within your birth chart when you were born. And so, Saturn takes about 3 years to move through a sign. So it's a transit that lasts for about 3 years. It starts for people between either the ages of like 27 to 29, depending on where your Saturn placement is when you were born. For me, it started at 27. I believe the same for you too, since we both had Saturn and Pisces, and our birthdays are only a couple months apart.
Mhm.
Um, so I want to put this in context of like the larger Saturn transit though, because you're right in that like a lot of the time as we're going through life, we're not necessarily experiencing the hardness of Saturn or like the boundaries or the restrictions that it's giving to us when we're not following what it is that we're meant to be doing. Except every 7 years, we go through a challenging or like a hard transit to Saturn. And I put hard in quotes because that's like what those aspects are technically described as. It's not necessarily that it's specifically challenging, although usually they are, but that would be the Saturn squares and oppositions. And so every 7 years, we get this kind of like report card around how we're doing in our lives. What it is that we're living into well, we'll experience kind of like a boost in that. Well, either you'll be kind of rewarded in some way. That's usually when people like get promotions or they like get engaged or get married or whatever kind of the themes of Saturn is bringing into their life within their chart and where that transit is moving through. That's where we get kind of the report card. And so the return isn't something that just happens in your late 20s, although that is the first Saturn return. It is like typically it seems like the most challenging one because it's the first one that you're going through and because it's just this time of life is like extremely differentiated from the second Saturn return, which happens in your late 50s. And then some people will experience a third Saturn return within their late 80s, but not everybody lives to the length of time to actually get to their third Saturn return. But essentially, every 7 years, we're receiving kind of like this report card, and there are similar themes that'll come up around what Saturn is representing and tuning into within your chart. And so it's not that this return just happens and it's like this isolated event, like it's a continuation of this story that's been playing out within your life. But what's happening again is like this is the most critical like junction around like the report card that we get about how we've been doing, what it is that's like going well, and where we've been putting our energy into that's really sustainable. Saturn is ultimately concerned with us having a sustainable foundation, especially within our return. We're looking ahead at like the next 30 years of our life. We've established ourselves as an adult in a lot of ways, but the Saturn return is really like where you come into that and where you are fully establishing your own self authority and yourself as an adult. So there's a release of certain like ties that you might have that's kind of been holding you back from that, or that's been preventing you from like really owning and leaning into that. There's also like an uplifting of the things that like are ultimately sustaining you and supporting you and like going to be lasting foundations. So typically within the Saturn return, like things wash away that will not be able to take root or that are not going to be feeding you over this next period of time in your life. For most people, that will look like experiencing a major career change. Like a lot of people have been in their career for a handful of years at this point and then realize like, oh my gosh, this is absolutely not something I can be doing anymore. Like I have to make a change. Sometimes for people, this is when they go back to school. Sometimes people like make a huge move during this time and like move to a new city. This is also when you usually see people either having kids and becoming more of an authority in their life because they're becoming a parent and they're having to take on more responsibility. People will get married during a Saturn return. People get divorced during a Saturn return. So it's just this major time period of like things being fleshed out, and also like the things in our lives that are really building us and that we're meant to be putting our energy into and that are sustaining us in the long term being like boosted and built up at the same time.
It makes sense why people would be afraid of the Saturn return in particular. But like you said, this is the continuation of a story. This is kind of something that's always playing out. You just might not be realizing it all the time because there are specific markers in your life where it becomes more obvious. And this is one of
Yes.
the biggest ones. The other ones, it's funny, it kind of
Yes.
makes me think of, end of the year report cards. By the way, I love this metaphor that we're using of Capricorn being the strict principal. End
Me
of the
too.
year,
It's so perfect.
it really is. End of the year report cards versus like semester report cards or mid-semester report cards, right? Like they're still letting you know how
Mm,
you're doing. They might not just be as major, but they're still
yeah.
good to keep in mind. Also, I have been feeling at home in my Saturn return so far. Of course, we would have to come back in 2 years, and that's what Caitlin and I actually plan to do. We actually plan to come back in a couple of years and let you know how our Saturn returns went and what we learned.
We're about 1 year in at this point.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm feeling fine.
Yeah.
As a Capricorn rising, I feel like at home. I feel fine. And I actually, Caitlin was telling my friend the other day, and I think I told you this too, because I've told you before that I've always been a small adult, just growing into being a large adult or a normal sized adult. I'm pretty average height. But as like even in college, I remember looking around and being like, I don't think I'm better than anyone here, but also I feel like the maturity level or our view of life is so different. Like, and I was
Yes.
telling my friend the other day, I was that I am so glad I don't have to pretend to find certain things funny anymore. Because I realized looking back now, it was all the things that we now see as very immature that I didn't think were funny. And I thought that there was something really wrong with me and I was
Mm.
just weird. And there wasn't something wrong with me. I was weird. Wait, I showed Caitlin this meme or this tweet of this guy who was like, stop telling children that they're old souls. I went my entire life thinking that I was an old soul when as a child, I was just a little creepy. Like,
Oh
you're
my
just
gosh,
weird.
it's so good. You're just like
It's
weird.
true. I mean, I think
That's
you could be
so
both. I
funny.
think the reason you come off as so weird is because you're an old soul in a small child's body. But I just feel
A
that
hundred
as most
percent.
Capricorn risings, I'm really coming to a time where it's like, this is the age I was meant to be. I can finally
Yes.
be myself and not apologize for the way that I see things and how I feel about things and how I act and how I talk.
Yes.
And so I just feel very much like I'm coming into my own. I feel great.
Oh, I love that so much. And that's such a testament to, I don't know, just kind of like the fear mongering that can happen on the internet when people talk about the Saturn return. Like, it's this huge thing that you need to be really afraid of because, like, Saturn's going to come get you. Like, it's not really like that. And it also really depends on what your relationship to Saturn is like with your own, within your own birth chart. Like, it makes total sense to me that you feel probably more like enlivened and like you can really be yourself. And like that can be seen, it can take root more within the world because you've been as a Capricorn rising, like Saturn is ruling the way that you literally walk through life day to day. Typically, what I find people who have heavy Saturnian placements, so either placements in Capricorn or Aquarius, is that I have an Aquarius moon. So, like, I relate a lot to your experience growing up and like always being a little adult. And like, you feel the inability to be fully responsible for yourself so much more. And I felt like my peers like didn't see that or feel that when I was a kid. And it like drove me up a wall. Like, I couldn't wait to like drive myself and go grocery shopping for myself and just like do adult regular things. And like, I don't know, that was like so exciting to me as I got older. I was just like, yes, like this is what it was always supposed to be like. But typically, people with really Saturnian placements, we have this feeling of like getting younger as we get older because we have just more freedom and responsibility of self. And like taking that on feels really good. Whereas when we're younger, again, it's like a heavier burden almost of not being able to do that. But then also, one thing with people like us that have heavy Saturn placements is that we usually have some kind of experiences in our youth that force us to grow up really quickly. So, like, it's not a lot of it's just natural to who we are. And also, there's usually some kind of external circumstances that kind of like force us to grow up faster. For some people, it's as simple as like they only had a lot of older siblings. And so, like, they just I don't know, they like didn't have the capacity to like feel as playful as a kid because they were more consistently engaging with adults or something. I see this a lot with like people who are only children, but I mean, this can also look like having some major childhood trauma where like you just don't get to experience your childhood to the same capacity that like you kind of should be able to, you know? So there's definitely that sense of like being able to come more into yourself and that feeling of just like comfortability and a sense of freedom around that, um, as well as that like the change in our relationship to what feels like restriction or limitation because the world is recognizing and perceiving us more as adults in our own authority. And I don't know about you, that's something I've struggled with a lot in my life where like I felt like I've been really written off by people because I was young when I was doing something. Like, I was really young when I started my business. And I was always like, I was like the youngest person in my grade. And so I just felt like I was always kind of like looked at this way. Like, I was so young and like not given the full amount of like respect and like appreciation that I knew I was due. And it was so frustrating. And it's been so interesting to like feel that shift around how others are perceiving me in return as well. um, so yeah, I love that. But that's such an important note around like how Saturn is in our chart if we're already having really Saturnian placements, and then how that means we're going to be engaging with our Saturn return. But it's also the question of like how we engage with this concept of like responsibility and what we are responsible for and to in ourselves and in our lives. You might not have any really heavy Saturnian placements and still just be engaging with that theme more, or with like a really high level of integrity that's going to make your Saturn return be a lot more comfortable and be more in like the reward sector than like the dismissing of things within your life sector. Like, especially if, I don't know, like it makes me think about some clients that I've had that like within their early 20s in particular, like knew that they needed to do something and like chose to not do that thing because it was a little bit harder, whether that was like finishing school or I don't know, like not partying as much as they wanted to or whatever. Like, it usually when people choose what seems like the easier path, even though they have the intuition that they should be moving in a different direction, but it's just that it's going to take a little bit more work to get there. That's usually when Saturn comes in and is like smacking you around, and it feels pretty harsh.
Yeah, because Saturn is one about adulting. Basically, if everyone listening hasn't picked that up, in a lot of ways, it is about being an adult. I mean, you can still have fun as an adult. You can still be innocent and childlike without being immature. I've been thinking about the
Yes.
difference between those two things a lot lately. Like, you can have the joy of a child without being a dickhead of a child.
Yes, a hundred
Um,
percent. A hundred
yeah.
percent. I love that. And I feel like that's what like Saturnian kids we feel a lot more. And we're also like questioning about other kids when we're growing up. We're like, ew, like why are you doing that? I remember being like, you guys are so embarrassing,
I was
like
like, and
about
how did
other
none of
kids.
you see it? And the thing is that it
Yes.
always made, I knew I couldn't say anything about it because it made me look like I thought I was better than other people. And I was like, no,
Right.
I just
And it's not
know
that.
you can be better. Like, no, just stop it. Stop doing that. Stop
Oh, it,
fucking quoting The Hangover every 3 seconds. We all
oh my
know it's a
God.
popular movie right now.
The
Stop.
Hangover and Step Brothers. Like, I'm like, just shut the fuck up.
Oh, I was shielded from that, which is great because I actually love Step Brothers. Like now I've
Oh,
seen it. It's like I love
it
that
is the
movie
best. I
so
do
much.
love that movie too. I just feel like those were both like that same vibe. But anyway, 100%. Like it's exactly that. But that also speaks to this point that Saturn is pretty moralistic. Like Saturn is really concerned about right and wrong. And it's not that it's always extremely black and white, but typically the way that Saturn engages feels more black and white in that way. And so that's also why we have those experiences of like when you're in your Saturn return or going through like the square opposition of like this is a yes or it's a no. And like this is a space to put your energy into, or this absolutely isn't. And the experience of it becomes a little bit more black and white because of that moral piece of Saturn. But for you and I with Saturn and Pisces, that's like the least moralistic placement for Saturn. It's
Mm,
also in traditional astrology, like that's considered Saturn in its fall because Saturn wants regulation and structure and clear cut boundaries. And Pisces is no boundaries at any time. It's all oneness. It's all good. Why does it matter at all? Because like we're all in this experience of unification and like ultimately what you do yesterday is what you did tomorrow. And like none of it matters. And Saturn is like kind of struggling for groundedness there a lot. It is, it also makes it kind of for us like a slightly softer Saturn to experience because it's a Saturn that doesn't have the same capabilities as it does elsewhere. Like Saturn in Capricorn is Saturn in its home sign. And also, usually people with Saturn in Capricorn have a much more intense experience of Saturn because he has all of his tools there. Whereas in Pisces, he's like missing the tool belt that's like floating away in the ocean somewhere, you know? And he's like, I'm just like trying to do the best I can. But, you know, personally, I'm okay with that experience of Saturn and Pisces. Also, a thing with Saturn and Pisces is that it gives us this capacity to have, create structure around our belief systems and to be really engaged with our belief systems, with our spirituality, with our creativity. And so, like, the things that you and I do for work is like so Saturn and Pisces, like, so Saturn and Pisces.
that makes sense. So I want to talk a little bit about how we look at this in human design.
Yes.
I know less about Saturn returns in human design than Caitlin does about Saturn returns in astrology, but I know quite a bit. So when it comes to Saturn returns, first off, they do not last as long as they do in astrology because we're talking about Saturn transiting gates, not zodiac signs. And like I said earlier, the gates overlap the zodiac sign. So, for example, gate 36 is a Piscean gate because it falls in the season of Pisces. But Pisces has a bunch of different gates that fall into that season. So that means that when Saturn is transiting that gate, it's going to be for a shorter period of time. For example, Saturn is going through gate 22 for 4 months this year. It's between May 5th and
Mm.
August 25th. But in astrology, Saturn is transiting Pisces, which gate 22 is in, for 2.5 years. So that is the first thing. And then the second thing is that when you look at a transit chart, for anyone listening, that's basically like when what's happening in the cosmos right now, like a snapshot of that is overlaid with your birth chart, and it creates this new kind of combination chart of how you are feeling energy right now, kind of like quote unquote what your chart looks like right now. When you are looking at that for a Saturn return, you have to take into account that the other planets move at different rates than Saturn does. So for example, the moon moves at different rates. So when I took a snapshot of Caitlin's Saturn return with her chart, her foundation transit chart, that's like only really a given for that day or like for a few days. So she's going to have Saturn in gate 36 like for a while, but her being the emotional manifester that she shows up as on the specific day, I think it's June 25th. It is 31st of March, completely different in 2025. That's only going to be for a short period of time. So when you, just for anyone else looking at your transit chart for Saturn return, know that like some of those gates are going to change. So this kind of thing that you're seeing, it's like you can really only take it for the day or maybe give yourself like a few days of breadth there. But that's the first thing.
Mm,
And then I just want to talk about who you're going to be on the 31st of March in 2025. So you are going to
please
be an
tell me.
emotional manifester, and you are going to have four of the seven emotional channels defined. You are going to have a lot of emotional themes you're going to be going through. You're also just going to have a lot of channels defined. You're going to have 6124 and 1156 defined, which in particular, just interesting to me, those are connections between the crown center and the mind center in the throat. And so you might feel that for all the ideas, all the imagination that you naturally have already, Caitlin, you now have a way to really tell that through story, and you might be more inclined to do so. Just
Mm,
feel like your generator, excuse me, your Gemini mouth is just like going, going, going. Here's a story on this. How I see this. Oh my gosh, what a different way of seeing this is so interesting. And with 6124, that's a lot about I think that Johnny has the complete channel. I don't know. I don't have his chart up. Yeah, you only have 61 usually, but you're gonna have 6124, which is this exchange between inspiration to making sense of that. So Caitlin usually has gate 61, which is the gate of mystery. It's wanting to know the answers to the universe, but also the joy of knowing I'm never going to know that. So why don't we just kind of like think about that? That's kind of fun. Someone with channel 6124 is like, I need to know and I'm going to rationalize it. And when I get this little hit of inspiration, like I'm going to make sense of it. And they usually do. They do figure it out, right? Even if it only makes sense to them. Usually for Caitlin, it's like, da, 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 da. This is cool. This is interesting. I wonder how manifestation really works. Oh well, guess we'll never know. But like, it's cool to think about, right?
yeah.
But it's going to feel more like you understand that stuff. Like, oh, I get this. This makes sense. Like you'll have a sense of how to rationalize that random plop of like magical insight that drops into your mind. The one thing with channel 6124, and again, I don't know how long this is going to last for you, but something just to keep in mind at the end of March of next year, you just have a lot of emotion and energy moving through your body and your human design body graph at that time. So first off, a lot of emotion to process. It might feel
Mhm.
like you're really going through it for a few days. Very normal. Because I can't remember the last time I saw a combination chart that had this much emotional energy. But then on
Wow.
top of that, channel 6124, which is so funny, I can kind of see this in Johnny, can really try to live life through the mind and think if I can just figure this out, then I'm going to be able to live correctly, when that's just not the
Mm,
way that it happens. You can imagine things, you can understand things, which is a great way to gain a unique perspective on the world and help you understand the world that you live in, but it is not the navigational tool. So, really remembering to come down into the body, and I'll tell you, it might be that you feel you're going to have a lot of emotional energy and it's like, I can't handle this. I need to go figure it out.
yeah.
So, yeah, that's just what I want to tell you about your Saturn return coming up in
Oh my
2025.
gosh. Well, thank you so much. That's all really cool to hear. And I feel like it's going to be really helpful. I'm like writing down the notes and like the days about when I'm going to experience this. And like I get like a year to prep for it, which is great. But also just knowing that that's exactly when Saturn is going to be transiting my natal Saturn and what Saturn is doing within my birth chart and like other planets that it's activating makes a lot of sense to me around like the headiness, the translation of intuition and insight through the throat. Like Saturn is exactly square to my sun in my birth chart, which is, in Gemini. And so all of that activation around the intellectualization, but also just like the verbal emotional processing and like the emotions being translated through that space makes a lot of sense.
Mm,
That's so cool. Thank you.
of course. Would you like to know more about your conscious Saturn and how this is going to play out? Because I took some notes and I would love to share.
Tell me, I would love to know.
Okay. And everyone else looking at your charts, if you check out what your Jupiter placement is and then your Saturn placement, both conscious is really what I would pay attention to. You can kind of work this out for yourself too. And if you don't know what those mean, the Gates and Channels course is coming out soon. So you can piece it together and we're going to talk about what the planets mean too. So not just Saturn, but the other planets as well. So, okay, Caitlin. Okay, Caitlin, you're funny, Caitlin. Okay. That's a story we'll tell another time. So your conscious Saturn is in gate 36 on line 2. So gate 36 is the darkening of the light. It's also called crisis in human design. Darkening of the light is what we call it in I Ching. What we call it in I Ching, as if I know I Ching. It is so complicated. So crisis is what we call it in human design. And
Great.
yeah. So basically, you have Jupiter in gate 9 on line 4, which we'll talk about in a second. But when you don't pay attention to your Jupiter, when you overlook the details, because gate 9 is the gate of details, so you're like, it's fine. I'm sure it's fine. And you're doing that not from a place of like authenticity, of like, this really doesn't matter. I don't need to be putting my energy here. That's a distraction. But instead, you're doing it from this pressure from the outside world. You're going to feel like you fall into like crisis and drama. And then I'll tell you with the configuration in your chart, it could feel like you're falling into your own crises and drama, but I really wouldn't be surprised if it feels like you are suddenly overwhelmed by a lot of external crises and other people's problems. And it will kind of feel like, why has this been put upon me? Like, I don't want to be part of this. And you'll also probably feel like people just aren't getting you really. They might call you really dramatic, which is probably especially true for Caitlin because she is dramatic. No, I'm kidding. Because she's a reflector. Caitlin's like the least dramatic person I know, because she is a reflector and she amplifies energy. So already reflectors show us back who we are. They basically become us for a little while to show us what's going on with us and really feel into that. But what can happen with reflectors is that people can really project that onto them and be like, no, that's you, especially with having a lot of emotional energy, and gate 36 is an emotional gate. And of course, this kind of thing, this crisis is really going to show up more when you don't pay attention to Jupiter, which is in gate 9 on the 4th line. So that means anyone listening, she would have gate 9.4 in her Jupiter. So I would have a feeling that this is about staying true to the details you feel you really need to pay attention to or hold on to, no matter what other people say about that, but specifically no matter what the people close to you say about that, because this is the 4th line. It's about close connections. It's about deep connections with the people who really matter and feel like your actual tribe, your people. And it's about really having the bravery to hold on to those details or work on them or focus on them, and then share them with your own voice and say like, no, this is what matters to me. This is what I need to be paying attention to. Instead of being influenced by those around you who are trying to like get you to focus on something else or conform. Because 4th lines, the thing about them, they're so wonderful and they are so influential, but because they depend so much on their relationships with other people, not that they like depend on other people, but they put a lot into those relationships with other people. Like they matter so much to the 4th line. They could kind of crumble when the people closest to them don't agree with them or criticize them, because it's like, oh, there's a mismatch here. What's going on? Like my people and I and me are supposed to be on the same page. The 4th line brings people together. A lot of collaboration there, a lot of, when we are the same or it feels like we can really get on the same wavelength, then this is correct. Like we should be around each other. So when that doesn't happen, the 4th line can be like, okay, there's something wrong with me or there's something wrong with you. We have to fix that. So someone has to bend. And a lot of the time with the 4th line, it can say, well, I guess I have to bend, right? Because I don't want to lose you. So with this in your chart, I'd say that an important thing is that when you notice something that really catches your attention or seems like this important aspect of life, it's like build a foundation with that by focusing on that and don't breeze by that. And you don't have to necessarily, like, if you see something, say something, but you may have to do something with it. And it's about really staying true and honoring those details and not letting the world, particularly the people close to you in your community, even if they have the best intentions, right? Because human design is about individuation. So it's about doing what feels right to you as the individual and not really taking into account what the other person is saying as much. So even though you have these people around you who are saying like, are you sure about that? Do you really want to care about that? Or, hey, for the group's purpose, like you should just kind of blast past this and not pay attention to this thing. Instead of saying, okay, I'm going to do that, fall into this habit of saying, I'm really going to focus on this thing and hold on to it and have a determination to stick with it because I do think it matters. And the way that I could really see it playing out, and this is for everyone listening, this is just one interpretation. The way I could really see it playing out is when you don't actually honor those details. It could be in relationship that shows up that you're like, I should have really made that detailed boundary clearer with this person.
Mm,
And when I don't, especially because you're a 5 line and people will, just impose what they expect you to be able to do and what you will do on you. When you don't create that boundary around the details, like this matters to me, that's how you will attract other people's crises or get drawn into other people's crises and be like, what is going on? Why is this happening to me? Why are you including me? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
But I want to say one more
Wow.
thing. We really look at gate 36 as a bad thing because it's like crisis. That's not fun. But crisis is made up of the word opportunity in Chinese, and then another one. I don't remember what the other one is, but I just remember that opportunity is in crisis.
Oh,
And
that's
that's
really
because
cool.
when we go through gate 36 and we can really dive into the lessons of gate 36, which are like hard knock lessons in terms of emotion a lot of the time, or external crises that we don't feel we control, but a lot of it can be internal crises too. When we go through that and we embrace this and say there was nothing wrong with that, that's when we can learn from it and become such strong people, very resilient, especially emotionally. And this is also how people with gate 36 get through
Mm,
that time. And then later, as other crises come up, it's like, this is nothing. Do you know what I went through? Even if you didn't see it because it was all on the inside, that's nothing. I've got this. It just makes you a stronger person. And what a
yeah.
fascinating lesson to go through with Saturn.
Fascinating is a good word. I love that connection to the Chinese symbol for crisis and it containing opportunity that like resonates so much and is such a great perspective around it. But what you just shared feels like my entire like life, especially like my emotional life. And it's been really interesting because I've also definitely experienced that on the other side with like the gate nine stuff when I've had friendships or relationships where I don't feel like well, a lot of it's been on me, like not a full honoring of the boundaries that I need, and also just receiving the expectations that people are placing on me and attempting to meet them there. Um, it's just interesting because I've been given the feedback that people like because they don't have the experience or like they don't know what I've moved through internally or like all the ways that it's moved me. And then there's like all these like projections that are happening around it. And then I'm not speaking like what I need to or like standing in myself in the ways that I've needed to, I've been given that exact feedback around my emotions or like there being like a coldness there or like people just not understanding it or feeling like I'm like emotionless. Like that's what people have told me before. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm like the absolute furthest thing from emotionless. It's just like what's happening right now, like literally is nothing. And it's not that it means nothing. Like I'm experiencing a thing around it, but like I'm fine and I'm gonna be fine. And like I'm not going to have this big emotional reaction just because that's what you want from me.
Mm.
So I'm just piecing together all of the ways that I've seen that play out in my life. And that's really good to know that that's a potential, well, that is a theme of like my exact Saturn return. It's something that I can be paying attention to in the meantime, especially.
Also, that whole thing about like, I'm not going to have an explosive reaction to this, that's so the undefined solar plexus center, too. Okay, so I was going to talk about my conscious Saturn in my Jupiter in my chart. And then I think that we can finish pulling back to astrology a little bit and then talk about like our specific Saturn returns in astrology.
I think that sounds great. I can't wait to hear more about your Saturn.
Ooh, okay. I love talking about myself, so this is great. The real reason I have a podcast to talk about myself.
That Leo mood.
Seriously, wait. I was talking to my mom about it the other day. I was like, I feel that at all times my soul is like wearing a top hat and like has a cane and tap shoes and it's like da, 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 da. Hello my people, my audience who is the world. Like throwing glitter. I'm like, how do you feel about that? How do you like that? Does this make you pay attention to me? It's like a one woman show
Oh
at
my
all
God, that's
times.
so funny. I love that about you guys. As an Aquarius moon, I just like feel like I sit back and watch and I'm like, wow, look at you do your thing.
I love Aquarius moons. I just love Aquarians overall. I've just always thought Aquarians, it's so funny because when you talk to them, they're like, I'm weird, I'm an alien. Ugh. But everyone else is like, you're so cool.
I feel like that's something that Leos see and appreciate about Aquarians so much because Leos like want to stand out and they love individuality. And they love when people are just like off doing their thing and like being the weirdos that we are as Aquarians. And that's also why Aquarians love Leos because we also love and appreciate individuality. And we love that you guys like are just your own people and want to be recognized for that.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to hear about your Saturn.
Okay. So I have conscious Saturn in gate 22 on line 3. And line 3 is a lot about experience, jumping in, trial and error, just to give everyone an idea. So there's been a lot of that in my life. If you have your Saturn line on line 3, give yourself a lot or line 6, like give yourself a lot of compassion because a lot of this is like jumping in and getting burned and then trying again and seeing like why didn't that work and like sometimes feeling like you kind of go through cycles with things. With gate 22, that's the gate of grace. It's also the gate of openness. And so I do have this ability, I feel usually to work a room when I feel really happy and sparkly and good. It's just, it's natural. Like you can feel it off of me. Like that is when my Leo sun really shines. And I feel like I am the sun, just radiating life and vitality. I feel like I am the giver of life to those around me. If anyone's watching on YouTube, I am this. But I will feel so ungraceful when I'm not following Jupiter in gate 5, which I'll talk about in a second. So I will feel, on the other hand, like there is so much wrong with me. Like I can't say the right thing. I feel so unsparkly. I cannot work a room like I usually would. I feel very, very disconnected from people. I have a lot less grace for myself, which is a huge part of gate 22. It's about seeing beauty and grace in everything, and it really starts with ourselves. And so a lot of the issue with the shadow of gate 22 is not having any grace for yourself and not understanding that there is beauty within you just the way you are, at any given moment. It's so simple. It comes down to the most simplified fact that you are meant to be here, and there's a beauty and a perfection in that. And so I'll have a lot less grace for myself, and I'll also have less grace for others. Like I'm usually pretty easy on others compared to how I am on myself, which is a lot for a Capricorn rising. We're harsh taskmasters. But it's funny because this gate is actually a lot about not forcing the grace when it's not there. Like the biggest issue for people with gate 22, it's not seeing the grace in yourself, but a big reason why that can happen and sort of we can get into this cycle with it, or this downward spiral, is because we try to force this energy, which we know is there sometimes, but like we want it there to be all the time, it to be there all the time. We try to force it when it's not there. And this is an emotional gate. Like it works on an emotional wave. It's part of spontaneous highs and lows. Sometimes it's just, you're just going to have this energy pulled back because it's like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to socialize. I don't feel like I can do that. So when you're feeling low in that way, you are supposed to pull back. You're not supposed to force yourself to go out and be the star of the show or the belle of the ball, the life of the party. It's about knowing that when you can trust that when you feel better, you'll be able to go do that. That helps you actually activate this and feel so graceful, and feel like you're in within the grace of life. And it's so funny because my conscious Jupiter placement, which is the law that I have to follow in order to, feel the, to not get smacked around with gate 22 by Saturn, is gate 5, which is literally the gate of personal timing and patience. Like it's a lot about patience and trusting the patterns of your life and life in general, and saying like, right now, the time that this thing is happening or the time that this thing is going to happen, that is the perfect time for it to happen. So when I try to rush timing, or I don't respect the timing that my body or life is giving me, I get into a lot of awkward situations, especially ones where I'm trying to connect with the wrong people. I feel like I TMI people, or I just really say the wrong thing. And I do feel really alone. I don't feel like I can shine. And this happened to me a lot as a kid in particular. I felt like I was so bad at connecting and communicating with people, which is something I really, really wanted to be able to do. But with Saturn in the third house in astrology, like that's actually a big thing. People like me tend to have a lot of issues communicating with people our age when we're younger. But yeah, so I always wanted it so bad to connect with other people, but I also felt like I couldn't really do it. And that made me feel like very vulnerable and easy to step on. Gate 22, like gate 36, is in the emotional solar plexus center. And again, it's the gate of openness. So I felt like my emotions got stepped on a lot because I didn't trust, like, I didn't know how to share at the right time. And a lot of people with gate 22 don't. So it's a gate that really gets easier as you get older, but also I've learned a lot about respecting the natural timing and rhythms for, when I actually want to do things and when feels right, and not trying to push life and be so impatient and be like, this is wrong. The timing is wrong. It should be happening now. And instead, really lean into that, which is a thing that I actually have fought against for a lot of my life because especially as a generator, I'm like, I'm slower than other people. This should be moving faster. I shouldn't be where I am right now. I'm doing something wrong. I need to fix this or do something differently, which is something that's really coming up during my Saturn return. I'm just realizing this right now. I'm really feeling that a lot more. Like we're not in my actual Saturn return according to human design yet, at least not for like a few more months, but I'm already feeling that energy because I am in my astrological Saturn return. And yeah, so I'm just really leaning into that timing more and trusting that timing. And gate 22 is also about simplicity. So when I don't follow my rhythms, another thing that happens is that life just starts feeling super complicated and heavy and shitty.
Mm.
And that's like a really big sign for any generator because things are supposed to feel like light and exciting and, satisfying for us. And so, yeah, that's where I am right now.
Mm. Wow. Wow, thank you for sharing all of that. It's so fascinating to hear just the different themes that come of it. And obviously, like, I don't we see it so much more distinctly through our design, but we're such different people. But it's so cool that like we have Saturn within 6 degrees of each other and like we have such different experiences of it. And I think that speaks to the nuance that we receive when looking at it through the gates as well, as far as where those different placements can come through and like what differentiation and nuance that creates, even though it's like Saturn in the same sign. Um, but it makes so much sense as far as like the crossover too between your experience of that with gate 22 and also your third house and Saturn being there.
Yeah. So I would love to know, you might not have felt this yet because we're just at the beginning. How do you feel that your Saturn return has been affecting your 11th house placement of Saturn and Pisces?
Well, I mean, honestly, I feel like the day that our Saturn return technically started, I like felt it immediately. Like
Wow.
my Saturn's at 24 degrees of Pisces, so Saturn's currently at about 7 degrees of Pisces, so we have like quite some time until that's exact. I think it's probably exactly that time period that you mentioned, like late March next year, where that's happening for me. But I 100% feel it. I also really feel, okay, so this is a little more nuanced as far as where Saturn's coming in the chart for me, but I have my Venus and my Mercury in the early degrees of Gemini. I have my Mars at 10 degrees of Virgo, which is opposite to Pisces, and I have Jupiter also in the early degrees of Sagittarius. And so Saturn transits all of them going through my Saturn return. So even though my Saturn return isn't technically till the latter part of the transit, like this first half of the transit is me receiving a Saturn square to my Mercury, to my Venus, to Jupiter, and an opposition to my Mars. So I feel like all of those pieces so heavy.
So
And
basically, you
that was
just
like
are already feeling Saturn a lot, is what you're saying.
like like so much, like it's insane, and like I'm so ready for this Saturn transit to be like over already. But I will say what I just experienced before Saturn moved into Pisces was Saturn transiting my moon sign. This is already so much better. Like already so much better. The day that Saturn changed into Pisces was like so distinct for me, and just the relief that I felt with it not being in the same sign of my moon anymore. But anyway, I've really felt like the 11th house placement, especially with the way that Saturn has been engaging with Venus for me. So, like, as soon as the Saturn return started, I went through a breakup. I went through, I mean, you know this, but like I went through a breakup with somebody that I had been with for over 3 years. And like my community and like the groups that I had been involved
Mm.
in for years of my life were so intertwined and like wrapped up into this person and his life too. And like I immediately was not connected to those people anymore, like it was that Saturnian limitation around the communities and groups that I was a part of, and like sense of isolation that came through with that. Then there was also, of course, like the Venusian theme in that around like the relationship aspect of things. Um, so that was one way that I like really massively felt that, but really like I felt it so strongly as far as Saturn and how Saturn engaged with us around our own authority and how we claim that within the 11th house. Like, as soon as Saturn transited into my 11th house, I started teaching Reiki. I had been like working on and developing the curriculum around that for a while, but I didn't start teaching until Saturn got into my 11th house and into Pisces. So, like, I was stepping into that role of teacher more. I also started teaching yoga during that time, and I had gone through my YTT over a year before and just didn't teach. Like I just kind of sat with it for a long time. And so I started teaching yoga, and then that like has become something that I do for like 10 hours a week now. And I absolutely love doing it. And like when I went through my YTT, I had no expectation of even wanting to teach at any point. And so it took Saturn coming into my 11th house to kind of recognize the um I don't even love using the word authority with it, but like just the maturity and capacity that I had to like hold and facilitate the space for something like that. Especially for like, I mean, the 11th house, it's so literal, like teaching groups of people. But also like, especially within the community that I'm involved in, like the yoga community in San Diego is something that I've been involved in since I moved here and has been such a crucial like part of my, I don't know, journey and experience. And so stepping into the role of teacher more with that and like claiming my own maturity and authority within that space has been huge. And I feel like that side of things has just been developing as far as the work that I do as an astrologer as well. Like it's transitioning from being more one-on-one to facilitating groups and like workshops. And I've been like developing courses and stuff more, which is it's all stuff that I've wanted to do for a while. And it's also stuff that I didn't have the capacity for or feel like I could confidently claim as my experience, as the like maturity and understanding and like wisdom that I carry to be able to actually like step into that as teacher. But okay, there's one more piece of this that I want to bring in as far as nuance, which is that Saturn is in my 11th house, but Saturn rules my ninth house and my 10th house. And so that's my house of the ninth house is education, higher education, philosophy, spiritual learning, teaching, travel, and like the things that we learn from other cultures that we integrate into our worldview. And the 10th house is career and where it is that we're most public and like what's most visible for people. And so it's also like both of those are so thematic of how I've experienced my Saturn transit. And then it's just like the 11th house space that's been actualized in my life in the last year, and I'm sure it's just going to like continue being that.
Yeah, I'm excited. I've definitely noticed that there's been a strong shift, at least from the outside, in your life and how you're approaching. Because I mean, we were just talking a while ago about how you wanted to shift more from one-on-one work to teaching, and you definitely have been doing that, and it's really exciting to see.
Thank
I'm
you.
really just gonna very quickly talk about my experience with Saturn in the third house in Pisces. So,
Please.
for me, the way that I've really felt it is I read somewhere once with Saturn and Pisces, especially during your Saturn return, it's a lot about drawing boundaries and not letting people step over them as much. Because again, we talked about this. Pisces is fine with the watery, there is no boundary. Like water has no boundaries. What are you
Yeah.
talking about? This isn't Earth. This is not the boundary between mountain and not mountain. It is not that clear. Everything melds together. And it can be a big lesson for people with Saturn and Pisces to stand up for themselves in some way and really draw boundaries and not let people come into your space who will take advantage of you emotionally just because you believe all is one. And it would be really nice if all is one, remembering
Yeah.
that there is the personhood there, there's the structure and respecting that. There's nothing wrong with that. And then also in the third house, it's a lot about communication and using your voice. And I have been going through, this, I guess you could call it a transformation. It's really more of an opening up, and Caitlin knows this, where I'm just saying more of what I want. I'm so tired of people coming in and I feel stepping on me because I didn't say something they agreed with. And I'm just going to stand up and say it and know that if it rubs people the wrong way, it does. And it's really not my job to take care of everyone. It's really about owning my own voice. Um, and really, and this is for everyone listening to me, for everyone finally listening to me, for
Everyone listen to me.
listen, for everyone listening, this is specifically because I have this in the third house. It's really about voice. It's really been important for me to just embrace my voice and understand that it has a place. And I love the all is one kind of thing. So when people, attack me for saying something, I can think, well, I should just let them in and have compassion for them. And I do, but I can do that in a very Saturnian way of, that's great that you think that. You can leave. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Saturn in your birth chart is making this aspect to your moon. It's called a quincunx, which means that like a quincunx is like without getting too deep into the nuance of it, like it's not one of the main types of aspects that we like just look at within a chart, but what it's doing and what it's speaking to is like these are two signs that like really don't really engage with or get each other. And so when planets are making that, it's like there's just a differentiated way that they're operating that they're not on the same page, and there's kind of like a challenge in the way both of those things are being expressed, and it's not a clear challenge in the way that we experience like a square or an opposition where it feels really obvious that like these energies are kind of creating friction with each other. It's a little bit more like ships missing each other in the night, but then like I don't know. Actually, it reminds me of, and I've never really had this experience, but like I imagine working at a place that's open for like 24 hours and like you come into your opening shift and like whatever the person who was there that they did last night, like totally fucked with everything that you need to do, but like you didn't actually see it happen. Now you're just like having to navigate with and like deal with the ramifications of it. But then like once that person comes in the evening, like everything that you did is like counter to what they need to do. And so it's
Mm.
kind of there's just like this weird back and forth energy. Anyway, that's the exact aspect that Saturn is making to your moon, which is
Mhm.
obviously in Leo. And so it just makes so much sense around the dynamic that's come through within your Saturn return, not just it being in the third house, with the communication and the expression aspect of it, but like with it being this expression of yourself and the space that you take up and how you're willing to be seen in that. And also that having been something that when the limitation or the expectations from other people have been placed on you, that it's like your Leo moon that like wants to shut down more, or that stops taking up the space and stops feeling as like sparkly and excited and like the sun behind you, you know? I
Wait,
think
can I
that's
say
really cool.
something about that too? What just
No,
came up for me? Well, that's
no.
unfortunate. It's my podcast, so say goodbye to Caitlin, everyone. It's
Sorry,
my
I'm
show
I'm
now.
just being Saturn here.
Yeah, da, da,
Please do.
da, 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 da. It's my show. Um, what came up for me, and this makes so much sense because I was actually thinking about it and I didn't put it in the notes. I don't know why I didn't, but one of the things that I've really felt restricted around with my voice is showing up as my full Leo moon because I have a lot of childhood wounding around that. And so for a long time, like I didn't feel like and I still am working on this, and it's so clear to me that it's showing up right now in the Saturn return. Really feeling like I can just open up and just show who I am, even if that annoys people, even, and it's not even really that it annoys people. That's never like, I can tell they can't quite put a finger on what they don't like about it, but I'm just rubbing them the wrong way by being happy.
I don't know. It's always so interesting, like the dynamic that comes through when we, like, with those pieces of like the trauma that we receive in childhood, especially with our peers in that way, because it's always just like this thing that's playing off of each other, but we don't have the emotional like maturity or understanding of that at the time, obviously. So then it creates like all these narratives for us that we have to go and undo later. But it's been
Yeah.
beautiful watching you unravel that and like just own it and be seen and be shiny and be your full self.
Thank you. You too. I think I got to a point where I just realized, and it's very freeing. I'm getting a little off topic here, but realized that you can say anything and someone's going to be mad at you. You can do anything and someone's going to try to come step on you and like smother your flame, right?
Yes, yes. Somebody's
Um,
always going to have some kind of issue.
everyone's going to have some kind of issue.
There's also just a level of maturity that you reach where you go like, okay, I'm like, why would I even try that? Because now I'm unhappy attempting to placate all these other people and just like not even being myself. So like someone's always going to be unhappy, then like that's not on me to try to fix or to do anything about or to hold.
Absolutely not. And I can see our five lines showing through so strongly. By the way, Caitlin and I found each other on Instagram the other day in the comments section of this account that we like. I didn't know that you were following them, and I don't think you know I was
I didn't
following
know
them.
you were. Yeah,
But
I
there was
loved
a
it.
post about about three fives, and Caitlin was like, "Oh, this is so true." And I had commented like, "Yeah, can we give our three fives a break?" And then I saw Caitlin's comment, and I was like, "Oh, hi! Fancy meeting you here." If
It
you're a
was so
five line, the
fun.
account is called Heretic Haven, and it's funny. It has a lot of funny five line memes.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. You'll just feel so seen at the five line. Also,
Absolutely.
I love you back on social media.
What'd you say?
I said I love you being back on social media.
Oh, thank you. But anyway, I love you so much. You already know.
I love you so much. Thank you for this. This was so fun. And thank you for sharing all the things about my Saturn return with me. I feel like I just got like a free mini reading.
You did. And I also got one from you, as per usual. This is what's so great about being friends with an astrologer or being friends with a human design reader who like really loves what they do and also really loves you. Like you get just a bunch of free information on your chart. So, Caitlin, you rock. Everyone listening, you rock. And I will talk
Ariana, you
to
rock.
you. Oh my God, thanks. Okay, I'll talk to you next time. Bye.